Thanks very much. Is the audio okay? I can't actually tell from where I am. Loud enough? Good. Okay. Well, paradigms in general, it's an area of a term we first acquired courtesy of the research of Kuhn into as paradigms in astronomy. And he made a good point about paradigms actually should, to some extent, resist change. But they certainly do. And the person who probably had the most eloquent expression on how much resistance actually occurs to change from one paradigm to another in science in general was Max Planck, who's the person who discovered quantum mechanics as a solution to what was called the black body radiation problem in physics, which was the empirical discovery that the amount of energy transmitted from what's called a black body, which is basically, we're all black bodies, anything above 0 Kelvin is a black body emitting some radiation. And the profile of that radiation followed what you might call a pimple or a hill, up and then down. And when you attempted to fit the data to Maxwell's equations, you got either you could fit one side of the curve or the other side of the curve, but not the overall curve. So given that fit, Maxwell's equations predicted either infinite energy at low frequencies or infinite energy at high frequencies. And Planck solved it, I think, by doing what's called integration in the complex plane. And as part of that, he found that energy had to come in distinct units we call quanta, these days, quantum. Now, it's ridiculous to talk about a quantum leap because I'm making billions of quantum leaps standing right before you right now because the actual amount of energy and therefore distance and so on is tiny. But it was a huge change to go from a vision that energy is continuous to energy coming in discrete units. And he could never persuade his peers at the time of this concept. It was just impossible. And I must read some work by Planck in the actual original book, but he's quite a witty man. The statement that science advances one funeral at a time is attributed to him. And in more detail, what he said that a new scientific truth doesn't succeed by persuading the opponents, the current believers in a different paradigm, to see the light, but because its opponents eventually die. And a new generation comes forward which is comfortable with the new way of thinking. Now, there's been lots of funerals in economics, but the paradigm persists. It survived that process that Kuhn talks about applying in physics. So what's going on? Well, I think fundamentally it's because you need a paradigm to beat a paradigm. You can't just point the old paradigm as flawed. You have to have an alternative. And if you look at economics, it has schools of thought which are alternative schools of thought to neoclassical economics, but I wouldn't call any of them truly a paradigm. So there's basically three. There's the Austrian school of thought, there's the post-Keynesian, and there's the Marxian. Now each of them have got some of the components of a paradigm, but none, in my opinion, fully meet what you need to have something you can actually call a paradigm. Now, if you want detailed exposition of all this, I highly recommend reading the originals. I recommend that in other fields apart from economics, but especially economics. But in philosophy of science, read Kuhn, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. It's a brilliant book. It's one of the most powerful pieces of writing I've ever read. It's only about 200, 250 pages. It's not big, but the amount of information and knowledge it conveys is enormous. And then Feyerabend for a different orientation, and Lakatos yet again, developing those ideas. But a paradigm needs to have, first of all, a set of core beliefs that all the adherents agree to. And so you don't need to waste your time establishing your preliminaries. They're already agreed to by most of your fellow researchers. That does not apply in post-Keynesian economics, for example. You need a methodology that can advance the scope of the paradigm over time. So there has to be a way of treating the area your paradigm focuses upon that means you can advance in a generally agreed to way of proceeding. You might be making advances that other people in your group don't make, or perhaps you have to persuade them of, but there's overall a methodology you can pursue. And there have to be unsolved puzzles that you need to apply this paradigm to, concepts that the paradigm itself to some extent selects. So this is something you should apply me to. And so you get a map to take the ideas forward. Now, if you look at each of Austrian, Marxian and post-Keynesian economics, in some ways they lack at least one of those essential prerequisites. So the Austrians, for example, have a a very strong set of core beliefs, which are very similar to the neoclassicals themselves, except that unlike the neoclassicals, they don't believe the economy is in equilibrium. They believe it's heading there, and they believe the gap between where you currently are and equilibrium is an important motivator of change in capitalism. But they don't, fundamentally, they do have this very, very strong set of core beliefs. One Austrian talking to another Austrian, they can feel immediately comfortable. Talking to me, they feel a bit uncomfortable, but that's okay. But they don't ever have a methodology. They talk about this thing called praxeology. I'd call it armchair theorising. Okay? Yes, it gives them a way of analysing the world, but it doesn't take them particularly far, and it's no different to what Jeremy Bentham was doing 200 years ago when he dreamt up the utilitarian philosophy. Marxians have a core belief, the later theory of value. But the trouble with that is almost immediately it's crippled by the transformation problem. Now, they worry about this. Neoclassicals have a very similar problem and completely ignore it. But Marxists, I remember when I first started doing my master's thesis, there's a lovely Marxian philosopher and economist called Bruce McFarlane in Australia. And Bruce, I told him I was working on Marx's theory of value. And he said, what, the transformation problem? And I said, no. He almost fell out of the building. Everybody who was doing a thesis in Marx was trying to solve the transformation problem. I regard it as a non-problem. It's mistaken logic. So you got a shock that I wasn't working in that area. And now, of course, you still have people trying to solve that in what they call the temporal single system, or TSS. It's a waste of time. People keep on asking me to apply my methodology to pull that apart. I couldn't be bothered. But in other words, Marxists get to a certain point and no further, and there's a paralysis in their methodology. Now, the post-Keynesians have a very good set of methodologies to work from. We've got people working from Keynesian methodology, my good friend over here. I base myself on Goodwin's work in many ways. There's Godley and Lavoie for doing stock flow consistent modelling. There's a whole range of useful methodologies. But we don't have the core set of beliefs. Each of us works from a methodology forward, and then if I talk the yarn about my work, I've got to explain where I'm coming from with my approach to Goodwin and my approach to stock flow consistent modelling and so on. So we don't have the foundations that we share instantly, and then Yar would understand where I'm coming from and he would hear from where I'm coming from. We have to talk that backwards, and often we won't agree. So we don't have that core set of beliefs. Now, we need that. I believe we've got to build a paradigm before we can overthrow the neoclassical paradigm. Now, how do you change from one paradigm to another? Well, you need anomalies, things that the dominant paradigm itself cannot solve. People keep on coming back to it, trying to solve the problem. They can't solve it. Now, frankly, reality is an anomaly for neoclassical economics. Okay? It's a persuasive set of concepts, which, to use the term from that wonderful American satirist mentioned early in the 20th century, he said every human problem has a solution, a simple solution, which is neat, plausible, and wrong. And that pretty much summarises the neoclassical school. The neatness and the plausibility drag adherents in, and they believe it fervently, but it doesn't fit the real world. But it survives because there's no rival paradigm. The attractiveness of those core beliefs is really quite immense. I do remember when I was a high school student, and for about half my way through my first year in university, I swallowed this stuff. I believed it. And then I had a lecturer who exposed me to a logical flaw at a point in my education where you're not supposed to learn logical flaws. This was what's called the theory of the second best. And I learned that applied to the issue of wage negotiations halfway through first year, courtesy of the lecturer who established the Department of Political Economy at Sydney University, Frank Stilwell. And that was the intellectual hole that I dived into to see why on earth does something which seems logically plausible not apply when you would take into a couple of pieces of reality. So that was the flaw for me. But neoclassical economics survives because there is no rival yet. And so you have this core set of belief, which is fundamentally utilitarian philosophy, and that survives anomaly after anomaly. The last major anomaly, of course, being the global financial crisis. The current one being why is economic growth so slow? after the crisis. The next one being what the hell happened to capitalism because it's been destroyed by an ecological crisis we didn't think was going to happen. That's the one you face. So we need a core theory of value to complete the post-Keynesian, generally speaking. That will be my foundation. I'll take some ideas from the best Austrian thinkers as well. But we need a core theory of value. So I argue you can form one by combining Marx's philosophy, which is called dialectics, which contradicts the labour theory of value. That was my first contribution to economics, published contribution. Thermodynamics, because the great embarrassment of all economics, not just the neoclassical school, but also the post-Keynesian school itself and the Austrian, is we're inconsistent with the laws of thermodynamics. There's a wonderful statement, I haven't quoted it in this lecture, but made by Sir Arthur Eddington, who was a populariser of physics back in the 1920s and 30s, and also the person who established empirically the correctness of Einstein's theory of general relativity by watching the transit of Venus and seeing the bending of light around the sun by the precise amount that Einstein's theory predicted. That was really the absolute confirming experiment for Einstein's vision. And talking about thermodynamics, Eddington said that if you have a pet theory that contradicts experiments, well, experimenters get things wrong sometimes. If your theory contradicts Maxwell's equations, well, so much for Maxwell. If your theory contradicts the second law of thermodynamics, I can give you no hope. The only thing you can do is to collapse in abject humiliation. Now, economics, technically speaking, has been in a state of abject humiliation for 1.5 centuries because none of the theories of economics since that time have been consistent with the laws of thermodynamics. The last person who could claim to be consistent with those laws, in my opinion, was Keynesian, the predecessor of before Adam Smith. We also need to have complex systems, and I'm going to show you later how complex systems vision of capitalism arises quite naturally, simply out of macroeconomic definitions. And finally, the monetary analysis of modern monetary theory on the one hand, circuit theory on the other, the essential role of money and credit that Thomas was talking about earlier this morning in our first panel. So, dialectics first of all. You would have probably all heard the idea that dialectics means thesis, antithesis, synthesis. Now, apart from being almost impossible to pronounce, it's not Marx or Hegel. That comes from a guy called Fichte. If you want to see an excellent book on the actual philosophical foundations of Marx, which I discovered after I'd reached the same conclusions, but it would beautifully summarise what Marx's dialectic is actually about. It's a book called Marx and Contradiction. I'm trying to remember the author's name. I managed to forget it while I'm standing here on stage. But that's a beautiful summary of what Marx's philosophy is actually about, Marx and contradiction. Ignore all the thesis. This is, I can't pronounce it myself without a good strong cup of tea. Instead, here's a concept what I call foreground, background, and tension. And the basic starting point is any entity exists in an environment. There's no such thing as something isolated. Whatever you're talking about, the real world, physics, society, and so on. In the social environment in which we live, whatever society we're talking about, whether that's feudal, slave, or capitalist, will focus upon some aspect which was called the foreground of an entity, which was called the unity. When you read Marx and Hegel, you see their actual language. You're focusing upon the foreground of some unity, but the unity itself can't exist without its background as well. So there's a tension between the foreground and the background. And that tension can change the unity and change society over time. So it's a philosophy of change. Instantly we get away from the neoclassical obsession with equilibrium, which is only a historical accident because the modern neoclassicals don't even know where they came from 30 years ago. They don't know their own history of thought, let alone if you go back to the 19th century economists who began neoclassical economics and see that they all regarded equilibrium as a temporary methodology before they developed dynamics, which they couldn't do in the 1870s. And they were quite legitimate to choose equilibrium then. The fact that equilibrium is still even a part of any of the phrases that neoclassicals use show how out of touch they are with the modern world. So here's that dialectical vision that drove Marx's thinking, that contradicts the labour theory of value, so we don't need to worry about the old TSS Marxist lot. Let them indulge their nonsense. Let's use it as a foundation for a decent economic theory. Society in which you're embedded, the unity, which I show there like a dog bone, stretched by society focusing upon its foreground aspects, its background necessarily existing, and therefore a tension between the two, which can transform not just the unity but also society. I don't elaborate on that in this lecture, but I have other lectures you can see which cover that particular point. So it gets rid of the labour theory of value, and it starts with an objective foundation, not the subjective foundation of the neoclassicals or the Austrians, but it enables a layer of subjectivity above it. You can flip from subjective to objective at different levels of analysis. That gives you a unifying way to talk about everything in general and then particular topics. Like subjective theory will turn up in your analysis of stock markets, for example, or your analysis of marketing, but not be the case as for your analysis of production. So you can flip from one level to the other in a very structured way. The thermodynamics is probably the most unfamiliar topic in this room, which is a pity, because not only is it absolutely vital that any theory of the physical world is consistent with those laws, it also resolves the value wars that are the reason post-Keynesians didn't get involved in a theory of value to begin with, because neither labour nor capital are the source of value. The true source is energy. And all the existing theories we have violate the laws of thermodynamics. We have production without energy. That applies to the post-Keynesians and to the neoclassicals, as well as the neoclassicals. We have production without waste. Those are impossible concepts. So there's a simple solution, and looking back on it, it amazes me. A, it took me so long to work it out myself, and B, that nobody beat me to it. And that is a simple insight. Labour without capital, without energy is a corpse. Machinery without energy is a sculpture. Neither can exist without energy as an input. So it's the essential input. If you don't have energy, you have nothing coming out the other end. That not just production, that's life as well. Energy is absolutely essential. And to do useful work, you necessarily generate waste. And the waste, when measured in kilojoules, energy units, necessarily exceeds the decrease in waste that gives you production. That's absolutely vital. So you have an integration of both energy and waste right from the outset. Now, so if you look at it in mathematical terms, rather than having output as a function of capital and labour, which is the starting point of both the Cobb-Douglas production function, Leontief, and the CES idea, it's not even this, output as a function of capital and labour and energy. But what that implies is you can have a factory full of machinery and workers and hit it with a lightning bolt and that'll produce something. No, it'll blow up the factory. Labour and capital channel energy to do useful work. So all you do is simply put energy as an argument into capital and labour. Now, I got that insight 10 minutes later. I had the solution for the Cobb-Douglas production function. And I remember thinking when I'd written it down, is that all? Is it that simple? But it is. So you start from saying the energy, that's a little lowercase Greek k, by the way, just to make the terms more obvious. You say energy, this energy throughput of machinery is the number of machines times the energy per machine times the efficiency with which the machines turn that input into useful work. And a similar thing for labour. So you have the number of machines or workers, and I've got number in inverted commas because adding up the number of workers is easy. And I'm actually talking people now, I'm not talking hours of labour time, I'm talking people here. It's a stock, the stock of employed labour. And the stock of employed machines, but how do you work out how many machines you actually have? How do you aggregate? That is still an issue. The energy consumption per year of labour, the energy consumption per year of that standard machine, and the efficiency with which both capital and labour turn that into useful work. Let's put that into the Cobb-Douglas production function. I imagine you've all suffered through that at some point. So we have this idea, it's A times L to the 1 minus A, so it's alpha times K to the alpha, the production function. I'm going to omit A first of all, and you'll see why in a moment. So I start from saying output as a function of labour and capital, which is the standard Cobb-Douglas, becomes output as a function of the energy throughput of machines and the energy throughput of labour. And I now simply have dropped those two terms into those expressions. Now rearrange a bit, and what I get out of that, there's your original standard Cobb-Douglas production function. This at the beginning, the energy consumption of labour times the efficiency with which that's converted into useful work, that is fundamentally a constant. You consume far more energy than a Roman slave. Okay? But the amount of energy you can actually output is pretty much constant. So most of what you're consuming is indulgence. You're benefiting from the amount of energy that our modern society consumes, exploits. But the amount of energy you can put into doing work is about 90 watts. You can do that for about 8 hours, maybe 12 if you're lucky, and that's it. So you can treat that as a constant. This bit has grown exponentially over time. It's the energy processing capability of the representative machine. Now, I'm not going to try to work out what that is roughly. I'm going to use the archetypical machine of our time. And if you think of the Watt steam engine, that consumed roughly 10 tonnes of coal per day. Elon Musk's Falcon 9 consumes roughly 10 tonnes per second. And we're now using, the latest rockets are now using methane rather than coal. So that's something like a 30,000 times increase in the energy input to those machines. Energy output is modified by the efficiency of conversion, but fairly similar. Now, if you look at what's done with the Cobb-Douglas production function, the alpha coefficient is chosen on the basis of income distribution. It used to be 0.3 because capitalists got about 30% of GDP and workers got about 70%. Now it's down to about 0.25 because capitalists have got more of the output and workers less. But it's rubbish. The best exposition of that is a paper by Anwar Sheikh called the Humbug Production Function. I highly recommend reading that. I give various summaries of the mathematics, but the reason it's rubbish is because if you use those exponent values, all you're doing is mapping a nonlinear conversion of output equals wages plus profits on itself. So you're going to get a high correlation coefficient that's absolutely meaningless. It's a tautology. To make it meaningful, and this is actually much to my amazement, I have to give a kudos to Gregory Mankiw. Never thought I'd do that, but he wrote an excellent paper in 1995 talking about the international comparisons of wealth. And that in that paper he said the only way to make the data consistent with international data is to double or more the coefficient we use for capital. Otherwise you get ridiculous comparisons of rates of growth, rates of convergence of income over time and so on. It's a very good paper. Now let's put this same thing into the Leontief production function, which is more realistic. Neoclassicals will often deride the Leontief because it has no substitutability. They haven't walked inside a factory. You walk inside a factory, there's X people per machine. Putting one more person on the machine doesn't give you any more output. In fact, I remember bumping into an engineer in one of the too many flights I've done around the planet, and he explained he was involved in making what are called RFID chips. So they're the chips that you let us locate where objects are around the world, very, very simply. And he said the machine that his firm manufactured needed 9 workers to make 14 million RFID chips per year. And he was going off to China. He had no idea why, but China used 16 million workers to make 7 million chips. Okay? The efficient ratio was 9 to each machine. There is no substitutability. You have more, they'll get in the way of each other. So that's what the Leontief equation has. And if you include U for capacity utilization, rather than making a minimum function, you can make it output is the utilization ratio of the existing capital divided by capital output ratio. So if you put that in, put my same expressions in, I'm now saying it's the utility times the number of machines times the energy consumption per machine times the efficiency of conversion. And I need to interpret EK, which is what does E equal K correspond to in the original term? Well, I'm mapping it across to the standard expression with U and K and V. And K times EK is equivalent to K alone in the original Leontief expression, because one thing economists do all the time is make dimensional errors. You're saying Y is equal to K divided by V, and V is normally given a ratio of 3, somewhere between 2 and 4. But Y is a flow and K is a stock. Okay? So when I put K times E to the K, I've now got a flow. That's a flow in megajoules or terajoules of energy. So I'm converting a stock of machinery into a flow of output. And E to the K is therefore 1 over V. So E to the K is telling us how efficiently energy input is converted into useful work. And actually for most of the last 40 years that's been rising. I think it's about to fall fairly suddenly. But that's what it actually amounts to. Now, one more thing I need to work out in terms of Leontief is what's A, which is labour productivity. Now, normally when you write the Leontief equation, you say output is the minimum of A for labour productivity times L, how many workers you have, or K divided by V, which in sort of in its own way implies a substitutability. And it also leads politicians to obsessing about how do we improve labour productivity? How do we make workers more productive? Get that A higher, that sort of thing. Well, let's go through and see what it actually turns out to be. I know this is going on too quickly, but you'll get the slides. You can check this later. I'm recording my presentation here. Starting with that expression, that's a constant. That's what I'm talking about earlier. That's about the 90 watts that you can put into work per person time. That's per person. This has been growing exponentially. Okay, the utility capacity utilization, of course, changes all the time. E to the K has been rising. I think it's going to fall, but they're both bounded between 0 and 1. The big one is E to the K, E lowercase k. How much energy is consumed by the average machine? So labour productivity is not the productivity of labour. Okay? It's the machines to labour ratio, K, if you look at the expression, you get K divided by L, multiplied by the useful work output of a machine compared to the useful work output of a labourer. So if you want to make labour more productive, build more machines. Make the machines consume more energy. That's what labour productivity is about. Now this raises a number of issues, and this again is this paradigm extending issue. I haven't yet worked out how to measure the number of machines in any objective fashion. That, of course, was done by Schaffer in the production of commodities by means of commodities, which I highly recommend you trying to read. It's not easy. I wrote a summary, a simplified version of it in Debunking Economics. I must admit that in writing that explanation, the first time I really understood it myself. So it's very hard to get your head around. But what Schaffer did is reduce all machinery to dated labour, which made sense in the context of accepting that labour and capital made commodities. But now what I want to have it in terms of is dated energy. That's what makes sense. Add energy in there. Solve for the energy. Reduce machines to dated energy. And in terms of a theory of value, going back to saying, what could we call ourselves? What I'm actually proposing, I'd call Neophysiocratic Economics, because the last school of thought to get it right were the physiocrats. They were wrong to say that agriculture was the only way to harvest what they called the free gift of nature. Well, they don't call it energy for one simple reason. The word energy wasn't invented until 1809. By that time, all the physiocrats were dead. Okay? So they couldn't use energy. But if you interpret their words in modern sense, the free gift of nature is the sun. And of course, we also now know that they did, which they didn't know then, that coal and peat were also the free gift of nature from about 50 million years ago. So we're living off that in the same way. Of course, now manufacturing can harvest that free gift by using coal. They didn't realise the link between coal and the sun. We do now. So in that sense, I think they were the only ones to get it right. And the person who led economics astray was Adam Smith. We need to revise economics, not completely chuck Smith out, but cease regarding him as the father of economics. I think he's the uncle who led us astray. Get back and read Richard Cantillon. Read Kinnaid. Their understanding, augmented by what we now know about fossil fuels, that's the basis for economics. So the whole value wars dispute between post-Keynesians, Marxists, all the rest was a waste of time. Marxists and neoclassicals. It's a waste of time and energy. Finally, waste is necessarily generated by production, which means we can integrate our work with ecology from the outset. The simplest measure of waste is the gap between the energy input and the useful work output. And that little e to the k that I had, little e dot k I had beforehand, that's necessarily less than 1. It's necessarily less than 0.5 because of the second law of thermodynamics. And the 1 minus that e dot k is your first measure of the waste. Now the other part of it, and also that's why the reason it's less than 0.5 is because the sum of waste has to exceed useful work. Otherwise you're violating the second law. More disorder is created over time. Disorder increases. And we need to elaborate. What I've shown you so far is just going from having output in terms of widgets. And if you think about the standard single commodity production functions that are standard in macroeconomics, it's either widget economy or it's a corn economy. That's what it comes down to. We need to go beyond that and say that energy is actually used to turn matter, which itself, of course, is a form of energy, turn matter into more useful forms. So as well as having waste energy, we have waste material. So it's only the very, very first stage of developing this idea that I've shown you so far. And of course, that waste matter includes CO2. So already you've got a very different orientation to thinking about the role of economics and energy together than we have out of neoclassical thinking. The next element is complex systems. Now, neoclassicals obsess over micro foundations, even though they have proven they don't exist. This I find incredibly frustrating dealing with neoclassicals here. I'll mention the Sonnenschein-Mantel-de theorem, and they'll wave their hands about, oh, we're bringing in heterogeneous agents, etc., etc. Bullshit. Pardon me, but bullshit. Okay? The Sonnenschein-Mantel-de theorem is as profound for neoclassical economics as the discovery of irrational numbers was for Pythagoreans. Pythagoreans thought all numbers were ratios of 2 integers. The unfortunate individual who first showed that in fact there were numbers which did not reduce to the ratio of 2 integers was actually the square root of 5 he was solving for because he was doing the geometry of a pentagon. His reward for that was to be drowned in the Mediterranean by his fellow Pythagoreans, so far as we can work back the history. Neoclassicals and selfists, but ultimately the Pythagoreans accepted that and built the mathematics of irrational numbers, starting with quadratics, that gave us mathematics that enabled us to develop our society further, complex numbers ultimately. All these ideas were because they accepted that fundamental contradiction. Neoclassicals try to bury it with the idea of the representative agent, and they're not even aware they're doing it 90% of them. Actually make that 92.5%. And it's also an instance of what is phrased more as different by a genuine Nobel Prize winner, Philip Anderson, talking in physics, saying that behaviour of large and complex aggregates of elementary particles is not to be understood in terms of a simple extrapolation of the property of a few particles. That's a common knowledge in physics, and you can see when it dates from. Economists are still trying to do macroeconomics by extrapolating micro. And wow, they've gone from extrapolating from 1 agent to 2 or 3. It's still extrapolation. Instead, we can have a macro foundations for macroeconomics. We can derive macroeconomics directly from definitions. What we're doing, effectively, is systems theory. I'll define the employment rate as the number of people with a job divided by the population. Does anybody want to disagree with that definition? The wages share of GDP is the wage bill divided by output. And the private debt to GDP ratio is private debt divided by GDP. Now, the strict definitions. There's no problem in aggregating. It's already working at the aggregate level. And I'm then going to have another definition, which I've shown you earlier, the output to labour ratio. I don't call it labour productivity for obvious reasons now, I hope. And the capital to output ratio. I'm still using V there. I need to integrate this with EK at some point, but that'll take a bit of time. And differentiate those with respect to time. That's quite a straightforward process, just applying the chain rule fundamentally. And what you get is three dynamic statements that is true by definition. It's not a model. The employment rate will rise if economic growth exceeds the sum of change in the output to labour ratio and population growth. That's simply dynamising the L over M by differentiating with respect to time. The wages share of output will rise and total wages grow faster than GDP. And the private debt ratio will rise if private debt grows faster than the economy. Now, they're simple factual statements. I'm going to use the x hat notation here. So x hat means 1 over x dx dt, fundamentally percentage rate of growth. Put that into equations terms, that's what you get. A stands for the output to labour ratio and N stands for population. So I haven't even done a substitution of assuming any particular rate of change here. So in that sense, it's still a definition. Omega hat equals W hat, where W is the total wage bill, minus Y hat. So I'm not assuming any Phillips curve relationship there yet. And D hat equals big D hat minus Y. Now, to make it into a model, I need some genuine simplifying assumptions. Now, on this front, what neoclassicals call simplifying assumptions, any sane person calls fantasy. You look at their assumptions, and they are fantastical. They're not leaving out the trees when you draw a map of the tube in London, which is the way that they will portray it in the media. It's assuming that you can travel at infinite speed on the trains, or that the train line connects you to Mars or something like that. It's fantasy stuff. So I'm going to assume a constant growth in the output to labour ratio and constant population growth, so alpha and beta, a constant ratio of capital to output, a uniform real wage and profit rate and uniform rate of depreciation, and a linear function for wage change. Of course, it should be non-linear, and I can easily bring that in, and the same for investment to the rate of profit. So I get three equations. That's the wage change function. So lambda s is the slope of the function, lambda the current value of the employment rate, and lambda z is the level at which there's no change in wages. And same thing with investment as a percentage of GDP. That's the slope of the function, that's the profit rate, and that's the level at which capitalists invest no more than profits, or exactly the same as profits. And I'm assuming that all credit, which is the change in private debt, is used to finance gross investment. Net, of course, you've got to subtract depreciation. So the rate of change of debt is gross investment minus profits. And what you get out of that is what I regard as the simplest possible model of a monetary capitalist economy. And it's three-dimensional. And that means, for reasons I haven't actually put the reference inside there, or the bracket to close the sentence I just noticed, by two mathematicians, Lee and York, says period 3 implies chaos. You need 3 dimensions to get chaotic behaviour. So those are the 3 equations. And just to elaborate what those definitions are, GR is the growth rate, which turns up over here and down here. IG is the gross investment level, which turns up over here. Profit rate, which is a function inside the IG. The profit share, which turns up here, and that's the wage change function. And you can elaborate that basic structure for more complex models as well. What you get is a simple system with complex behaviour. There are actually 3 equilibria, only 2 of them are meaningful. One of them has a constant above zero employment rate, wages share of GDP and debt ratio. That's where you'd like to end up. The other one has a zero employment rate, zero wages share and infinite debt ratio. That's where you don't want to go. But that's where neoclassicals have led us by saying private debt doesn't matter and leaving it out of economics and ignoring the accumulation of private debt over the last 50 or 60 years. Now, if I simulate them in my Minsky software, oh great, this is a bug. There are supposed to be elements shown inside each of those boxes there, and that's what's called, it's called an SVG, particular type of vector graphic file output. And under Windows, the most recent version of Windows, it stuffs up the characters. So I'll go across and I'll load the actual program to show that, which is that one. Okay, so let's just start with a low level of the desire to invest by capitalists. Now, you would actually probably, ipso facto, like to have a higher desire to invest than a low one. And what you find when you simulate this model is you get a gradual convergence to equilibrium over time, a long time. Only because it's a linear model. It'd be much faster if I had a non-linear model there. But you can see the employment rate here, the wages share of GDP, and the debt level all converging to an equilibrium level over time. Okay? So neoclassicals don't understand this, but it's what they think happens. Now, if I restart that with a high level of desire to invest, it starts off looking like it's doing the same thing. You can see the cycles, particularly in the growth rate, are declining over time. Okay? Look what's happened to this phase plot has the wages share of GDP on the horizontal axis and the debt ratio on the vertical. Look at the tilt. Okay? Over time, the amount going to workers is declining. Then something happens that cannot happen in a strictly linear model. The cycles start to get bigger. And finally, you have a breakdown. So the first part of that experience, and I've got to go back to the PowerPoint now to show the points I wanted to highlight. There's a great moderation followed by a crisis. The two processes are integrated. Neoclassicals treat one as due to their good management of the economy and the other to an exogenous shock, which in 50 or 60 years they'll finally identify. There's a higher debt ratio. If you look at the debt ratio here, it's particularly obvious in this phase plot, that was much higher than I showed you in the previous simulation. And you get increasing inequality. Even though in this model only capitalists are borrowing money and they're only using it to build factories, the complex dynamics of the system are such that the workers are the ones who pay for the higher level of debt. So a rising level of debt means a falling share going to workers. That's one of the explanations for rising inequality in capitalism in the last 40 years. Now, that's just a model without prices inside there. But again, in a definitional sense, it's very simple to expand that. And when I do, what I get is inflation turns up in two of the three models, two of the three equations. The wages share now depends upon the inflation rate, so does the debt ratio. So my equations now just have those two extra terms. And now to expand, I've got to make more assumptions because I have to have a system for pricing. Now, Jan, you might enjoy this little dilemma. I could have used Koleski's markup pricing equation, but I resisted that because something about me hates just plucking something out and plugging it in somewhere in an arbitrary fashion. And I was, how the hell can and I didn't want to see a supply and demand either. And one day I finally said, I just can't get anywhere. I'm going to work in terms of a flow of monetary demand and a flow of monetary supply, and then see what falls out. What fell out was Koleski's markup pricing equation. So if you actually look at demand and supply in a dynamic sense in a monetary economy, two things neoclassicals don't do, you get Koleski's markup equation. So that became my basis for setting the price in this model. And then I had the nominal interest rate set with a lag to the rate of inflation. Of course, also including a base rate set by the central bank. And let's see what that looks like. Yes, the same mess. Okay, I don't think I've actually got the that model running, so I can't show you the elements. But it's fundamentally the same model, and what's intriguing about it, that's the profit rate. So what you have is a period of large cycles, diminishing cycles, rising cycles, then diminishing again. Finally you reach equilibrium. Isn't everything wonderful? Oh shit. Okay. And what's actually happening is the share going to bankers, which is rising, overwhelms the share going to workers. So for a long time, capitalist share is bouncing around an equilibrium level, worker share is declining, and there's a rising share going to bankers. And then just when it looks like it's completely stable, because you've bashed so much out of the working class, they're on the floor, they're accepting the maximum rate of wage decline they'll accept every year, pretty much the stagnation we're seeing in wages share today. So they can't go any lower, but you're still paying interest to the bankers, and you've hit deflation. So the share going to bankers overwhelms capitalists, and goodbye capitalism. That's pretty much the situation we're in, with the added effect of the government trying to prop everything up, which I've left out of that model. Now, I can make it more realistic by adding the government sector, and you do it the same way. You have the government spending as a percentage of GDP added as an additional definitional argument. You then have to put assumptions for what drives government behaviour, and you get a more complex model still, and again more realistic. You need to acknowledge that production takes multiple commodities. We do not consume corn alone or widgets alone. So out of that, you get a multi-sectoral model of production. Again, the same definitional approach will get you to a model. So you can build macroeconomics, and you saw instantly I'm more realistic than the neoclassical because I can explain the two major events of the last 30 years, which to them are mysteries. One they take credit for, the other they're saying is exogenous. They both drop out of that model. And of course the micro is a set of fallacies anyway. Firms have falling marginal costs. Alan Blinder was the last person to discover this by accident. Fred Lee was the person who integrated all the excellent empirical research by post-Keynesian researchers for the previous century. Eitman, I think, gave the best simple summary of the reasons why marginal costs decline. Schrafer also in 1926 is worth reading. Then individuals don't, and in fact they can't maximise utility. The diagram you have in your textbooks, a little drawing in 2 dimensions, makes it look quite straightforward. Every time you add an extra commodity, you've got to add an extra dimension to your book. Once you get to 8 or so dimensions, people start violating the axioms of revealed preference. Okay? This is a beautiful experiment by Sippel in 1997. Even if you could show that theory worked, you can't get downward sloping market demand curve out of downward sloping individual demand curves. Yet another fallacy. And of course it lacks the theory of money. In fact, it's antithetical to the whole concept of money. So it's lousy foundations to begin with. So we need a monetary foundation as well. And thank God the central banks have saved me and Thomas and Jan and all these post-Keynesians from having ever to insist that loanable funds is wrong. We just quote the banks now. It's wonderful. The Bank of England. Rather than banks lending out deposits when households save, bank lending creates deposits. The Bundesbank, it's an accounting operation, refutes a popular misconception. Now, I love that because normally popular misconception means something the public believes that the expert knows is wrong. Now, in economics, most people in the public think banks create money. It's the so-called experts who are wrong, and they still won't admit it. The Bank of England about the money multiplier being wrong as well. The Bundesbank, nothing about reserves. So, it took them long enough, but 3 cheers for those central banks coming out and finally giving us a realistic foundation. What we haven't yet got is an explanation of the role of that in macroeconomics. And my starting point for understanding this was Graziani, the monetary theory of production. Forget about the mathematics. It's the wrong mathematics at the back of the article, but the logic is impeccable. And the conclusion that Graziani reached about how does a monetary economy differ from a barter economy is that any monetary payment must be triangular, involving at least 3 agents, the payer, the payee, and the bank. And that insight led me build Minsky. I didn't understand money until I read Graziani. Highly recommend reading that paper. And there also the important point about what does this mean? Are we just being structurally correct, but it doesn't really matter? Or is it incredibly significant? It's the latter. And in post-Keynesian, some post-Keynesians have realised this, not enough yet know the role of credit in macroeconomics. So you can explain it by using what I call a Moore table in honour of Basil Moore, another great pioneer of post-Keynesian economics, died a couple of years ago. And I'm going to do it in a logical way, working from the principle that aggregate demand is aggregate income. What you spend, expenditure, becomes income for somebody else. The two are necessarily the same. So I can divide the economy into three sectors, and it doesn't matter what the sectors are, as long as you're comprehensive. Each sector spends on the other two. The Moore table across the diagonal shows expenditure by one sector on the other sectors. Therefore, if you record the expenditure by the spending sector as a negative because it reduces the amount of money in their bank account, and as a positive for the recipient sectors, the row sums to zero, necessarily. When you sum the diagonal of that, the negative of the diagonal is expenditure. The positive sum of the off diagonal is income. They're necessarily equal. Each row has to sum to zero, and the overall table also sums to zero. But the column sums can be non-zero because one sector can spend less than it earns, but the other two have to therefore be spending more. So you have three monetary arrangements that are worth considering. One in which there's just money, Milton Friedman's helicopters flown over the island and dropped the dollar bills, and we all use those for spending, but nobody borrows and nobody lends. Loanable funds, where one non-bank sector lends to another non-bank sector. And what I prefer to call, rather than endogenous money, bank-originated money and debt, where there's a fourth. We now bring a banking sector in, so there are now four sectors. There's three non-bank sectors and one banking sector, and that banking sector lends to one sector, which then spends on another one of the sectors. And so when it lends, its assets rise and its liabilities also rise. So if you look at the Say's law situation, in inverted commas, by the way, because it's actually the reverse. Rather than supply creating its own demand, it's demand creating its own supply. But there is the expenditure by sector one, and those A and B are in dollars per year, or euros per year, or Clyde notes per year. A and B are the income received by that expenditure. The sum is necessarily zero. C plus E are the income earned by sector one from the other two sectors. And when you do the summing overall, you get zero for the entire table, zero for the sum of each row. And effectively, you get Milton Friedman's velocity of money times the amount of money in existence. Because that's, if I add A, B, C, D, E, F across the row, take the negative, exactly the same on the horizontal. So I can just add up the trace of the matrix in that particular case and do the substitution that A all the way out to F is M times V. I get M times V. That's Milton Friedman's world. Now, Paul Krugman's world is where sector one lends to sector two. And to show that, you have to show that across the diagonal. Because you get taxed on expenditure. The best way to explain why it goes across the diagonal is that you get taxed on income, tax on expenditure. You don't get taxed for making a loan. So the loan passes along the diagonal. And then I have sector one. The reason sector two is lent to sector one is to get interest income. That's why they're giving away the spending power. And then sector one spends on sector three. Now I can make it more complicated. There's a little phrase in mathematics that economists occasionally abuse, and I'm not going to abuse, without loss of generality. If I included all the various flows that could occur, I'd still get the same conclusion. So this is now looking at it with credit lending. So sector two is lending credit dollars per year to sector one, and sector one is paying interest dollars per year to sector two, and then sector one can spend B plus credit dollars per year on sector three. Work out your mathematics. There's the flow of credit. There's the expenditure of credit. Nobody borrows for the sheer pleasure of being in debt. Okay, you're borrowing to spend. It becomes part of expenditure. Take the trace there, and this was a surprise to me when it first happened because I was including deposit income in a more complicated version of this. It's gross interest payments turn up as expenditure. It's not a result I expected. So aggregate demand in the loanable funds world is the turnover of existing money plus gross financial transactions. But credit cancels out. So if loanable funds were true, you could ignore the banking sector. It's a structurally vital assumption by the neoclassicals to leave credit and banks and debt and money out of the macroeconomics. They don't know that, but it's the case. Now, what about bank-originated money and debt? Well, I've got to bring in a banking sector now that lends to Sector 1 and creates money in the process. And then Sector 1 spends that money on Sector 3. So it's a more complicated table. And I've got to just take the trace of the liabilities plus the equity here. So there's the change in debt, which creates credit. The credit goes to Sector 1, who spends it on Sector 3 and pays interest to the bank as well. So there's the creation of credit, there's the expenditure of credit, and then what you find is, when you do that sum, credit is part of your argument. Credit is part of aggregate expenditure and aggregate income. So they're identical, but expenditure includes credit, which neoclassicals leave out of their logic. Credit does not cancel. And since that is a true definition of how banking actually occurs in the real world, you can't ignore the banking sector. You must have banking in your macroeconomic models, which neoclassicals of course still don't do. And because credit is not only very volatile, it's also can do something that monetary turnover can't do. It can go negative. The plus that I'm showing you can be a minus. The fall in credit reduces money and reduces demand as well. So the only neoclassical that I know, well, therefore probably the only neoclassical period, who understands this is Michael Kimoff, who's the Chief Economic Advisor to the Bank of England. So Michael's papers using DSGE models give money an essential role and show the impact of credit. He's the only one. Now what it means is neoclassicals record this data, but they don't, like the statisticians do, but they don't consider it. The black line is the ratio of private debt to GDP over America from 1834 to last month. They ignored this. They ignored that. They didn't even know about this. Now at the bottom line is the rate of change of debt per year. That's credit. And when you look at it, you find that the three biggest crises America had were all periods when credit turned substantially negative. So the one we've all lived through, the Americans call the Great Recession, the Australians call the Global Financial Crisis. I think GFE is better, but I'll use the American term. There's the Great Depression. And there is something I didn't even know existed until I plotted this chart. What happened in 1837? So I went to Wikipedia, the fast way to do some research, and found what's called the Panic of 1837. And that, even though the level of debt was much lower back then than the Great Depression or the global financial crisis, the scale of negative credit back then was actually bigger and longer than both those crises. So a large part of why the American economy, the American society is as gangsterish and as militaristic and violent as it is because it grew up during that period when money was disappearing. Robbing a stagecoach was a damn good idea. Okay, money was collapsing. Now let's look at the economic impact of that credit. And the bigger the level of debt is, the more important the impact is. I've shown this chart hundreds of times now. Some neoclassicals have seen it. None of them have reacted to it, except one who gasped. He almost had a heart attack. And you saw the correlation, minus 0.85. If you read Bernanke, part of what he argues in the essays on the Great Depression is that what he calls pure redistributions, which is what, again, the neoclassical way of seeing credit, should have no significant macroeconomic impact. I think minus 0.85 is slightly significantly different to zero, don't you? That's what they're ignoring. And the causation runs from credit to demand, as I've shown in the Moore table analysis beforehand. The one country you don't find this relationship for is Germany, because the scale of its trade surplus until recently was so great that it could have declining credit, declining government spending, and still have a moderately okay economy. It's finally falling over because of that. And then when you look at, there's a slightly more mathematics to analyse the relationship between credit and house prices. but it's actually the rate of change of household credit that causes the rate of change of house prices. And when you do the correlation for America, you get a 0.71 correlation between the two. The data is overwhelmingly in favour of the general post-Keynesian orientation and the importance of credit. It's not something trivial. It's huge. So only by having a set of blinkers called a false paradigm can you not see this data. And of course, those blinkers are the ones neoclassicals are wearing. So I'll illustrate this in Minsky, and I think I'm going to have a hassle here. Let's see what comes up on the illustrator. Oh my God, it actually worked. Must be something in the most recent. Now I've actually helped identify another bug because there was something working in the previous version that didn't cause the loss of characters you could see in the previous graphics I grabbed from Minsky. But if I just bring up loanable funds, I think I've got it running in the background actually. Let's see, here we go. Okay, this is a model of loanable funds. And the reason it's loanable funds, I'll just make the godly table a bit bigger, is that I have the banking sector not actually lending. This is the assets of the banking sector, which just reserves. CD stands for the consumer sector's deposit accounts, ID for the investment sector, WD for the workers, and BE for bank equity. And what I have is lending by the consumer sector to the investment sector, repayment the opposite direction, interest payments the opposite direction, and then a bank fee being paid to the bank to give it some money for the service. And then you have workers being hired, intermediate goods being purchased, and consumption by workers and bankers. So if I simulate that model, I get a growth rate of 0, GDP flatlines at about 200, a rising debt to GDP ratio, rising amount of debt, but no change in the money supply. And if I then have the bank deciding to lend faster, notice the growth rate dipped when the rate of lending increased, and have a slower rate of repayment, growth rate dips again. Now the debt ratio is now getting very, very high. It's jumping up towards, so it is, it's a debt ratio of 80% of GDP and heading higher. It's over 100% of GDP now. What's happened to the economy? Nothing. Nothing worth talking about. Simulation will be running for 65 years, by the way. Now let's go in the opposite direction. So I have a slowdown in lending and increase in the rate of repayment. The economy actually booms a bit. And the debt ratio plunges. So I'll go back to the initial situation again. So enormous changes to the financial sector, bugger all in the macroeconomy. If that was correct, you could ignore the banking sector. But of course it's not correct. But what it's showing is that the consumer sector is the one that owns the debt. So here's the consumer sector's view of the world. One of its assets is its bank account. The other is the amount of debt that it's got. Notice there are the two sum together to 100. Okay? The reason being, it's lending out of the banking, its deposit account. So as debt goes up, the deposit account has to go down. Oh, but they're not equal, pardon me. They're creating, the debt actually grows faster because you can continue owing the money and then you've got to pay the money back to buy something off them, so you're borrowing more money, so the debt rises faster. The actual level of, the initial conditions are the important one where they start off being the same. So $60 is the amount of money in the bank account, 10 is the initial debt, 70 is the total net worth. All that's worked out correctly. These are all the financial flows occurring. But notice the debt's shown as an asset of the consumer sector. Now it's not. So in Minsky I can simply say, let's delete that and let's delete the financial operations as well. Now that is incredibly simple in Minsky. Minsky is not the first system dynamics program. The first one was built back in the late 1950s or early 60s by J. Forrester and one of his programmers. It was actually called Simple and Dynamo were the very first two. But all of those programs use wiring. None of them use double entry bookkeeping. So Minsky's innovation is the Godley table. Now, having got rid of debt as an asset of the consumer sector, it's still there as an asset of the, sorry, they've got rid of it as an asset of the consumer sector. It's still there as a liability of the investment sector. So I can go inside the godly table for the banking sector and say, let's make room for an additional asset. And what liabilities are there in the system that haven't yet been allocated? You can't see it. Let's see if I can bring it up. That's D for debt. So I click on D, and Minsky brings across the operations that still exist in the model. Now, I've got the interest coming out of the investment sector account, but I haven't got it going anywhere because I've deleted the entry for the consumer sector. So I click over here and type in the same expression. I've now got that accountingly correct, and I can delete the bank fee. Now, I should make a few more changes to the model, but I want to indicate simply that that change alone is all you need to get into a world in which banking matters. So now I've got a rising debt to GDP ratio. I've also got, as debt goes up, so does the money supply. There's positive rate of growth. The economy is growing over time. The point Thomas made earlier, you need credit for the economy to grow. Absolutely agree. We just agreed over the technicalities a bit. Now, if I then increase the rate of lending, there's a boom. Slow down the rate of repayment. Even more of a boom. Increase the rate of repayment. Reduce the rate of lending. You have a slump. That's what neoclassicals don't understand, not include. That's why they haven't got a clue where the economy is or where it's going. They don't acknowledge the role of banks, debt and money in macroeconomics. No wonder we're lost. So huge changes in credit cause trivial changes in GDP and loanable funds, make it into bank-originated money and debt, as I've just shown you. Huge changes in credit and debt, huge changes in the economy. So we need a new paradigm, desperately, to get rid of the old one. And we can build a new one by a combination of activities. First of all, we start from the laws of thermodynamics. We have a theory of production which acknowledges the role of energy and therefore acknowledges waste and therefore ties economics in with ecology at the ground floor. We structure it using dialectics. We start from thermodynamics, and just to illustrate the graphic I showed you earlier, the generic graphic, there's energy in the universe. That's the context in which we live, the entire planet. Human society is benefiting from that energy. What we're exploiting is the exergy, the useful work we can do with that energy. We can't avoid the entropy we also generate. And therefore we have ecological and social sustainability as an issue for ourselves on this planet. That's a completely different orientation to the way the neoclassicals pretend to think about the economy. The complex systems foundations exist. All the stuff I've shown you came from definitions. You can extend the definitions, extend the model. And we start from monetary analysis at the very outset. So those are the shared foundations for the paradigm. But also, for the benefit of you people in the room, it generates puzzles which can be PhD topics, or master's topics for the matter at the moment. How do you measure the amount of machinery? Take Schaffer's ideas and extend it to include energy. Include the government. I've done that in my 1995 model of Minsky. I haven't done it from definition strictly yet, but I easily can do that. Bring in multiple sectors. I've done that as well at some point in the past with an Australian government project, but I haven't written it up properly in Minsky yet. Multiple countries, international trade and finance are necessary. Asset markets. Apply the paradigm to numerous different countries. I have a PhD student who's now moved it off to Llanes de Thermos, doing his PhD under Llanes, but he's applying it to the Portuguese economy with an incredibly elaborate model using fundamentally the national accounts as the structure. And his model already outperforms the DSGE models and the CDE models that the Central Bank of Portugal and the Treasury use. It's far more effective than their models. So there's plenty of topics there. The paradigm generates the puzzles that are needed as well. And I'm developing Minsky to extend it further. Minsky has only had a tiny amount of funding so far. In UOK pounds, about £200,000. I've just got a grant from the Friends Provident Foundation to extend it. So having had not much development money for several years, I've now got 2 full-time programmers working on it. So Minsky will improve dramatically over the next year. I'd like you to take it and use it. Find bugs. Find bugs and report them. That's the way the software develops. And join the Patreon page we have Immensky, because that way we can actually build a user community as well. Now, I don't think there's any time to waste in doing this, because I'm not joking. I think neoclassical economics is going to cause the extinction of capitalism. Probably not the human race, but capitalism itself, because climate change economics is written by Nordhaus and Toll and Mendelssohn and even some of the nice people like, I can't think his last name, but Camillard. It's the worst garbage I've read in 50 years. I've read a lot of garbage. Reading neoclassical economics is a pain, but it's the worst I've seen. Now, I've said in general what neoclassical economists call simplifying assumptions are in fact fantasies. I've seen worse fantasies in terms of the logical realism of the assumption, but this is the worst in terms of its consequences for humanity. I wondered how they got such low numbers for the damage from climate change. And I thought it was because they applied a high discount rate to damages in the far future, and then the discount rate reduced catastrophic damage to almost nothing. Well, they do that as well. What they actually do is they pretend that the data you can find today on climate and GDP, the correlation you get out of that, the very weak nonlinear relationship you get, can be used to predict the impact of climate change. Now, if that were true, be nothing to worry about. It's false. There's everything to worry about. And they are drastically understating the impact of climate change. And when the productive system starts to fall apart, and we need a political system that can cope with that, it won't be one using dollar bills, it'll be one using bullets. I expect a military dictatorship to come out of this at some time in the future. They're also using an equilibrium framework for a distinctly non-equilibrium process. Now, I'm very conscious of this right now because my family, obviously I'm Australian, and you would have seen all the forest fires in California recently hitting the news. Same thing's happening in Australia. That's what climate change does. The calculations Dom reminded me earlier this morning, I've forgotten where I saw the source, I've got to go back and find it. But the rate of climate change is such that agriculture needs to move roughly 10 kilometres per year. Now, how does it move? Simple. The rainfall drops, the temperature rises, and what the forests start to burn. And you can actually see the smoke plumes from the fires in New South Wales and Queensland from space. There's a remarkable video that I've seen on Twitter in the last couple of days. That's the transformation we're going through. It's not an equilibrium process. They perceive an equilibrium position now to an equilibrium in the future, assuming that they can use current data to predict the impact. Trivial impact, nice and smooth, who cares? Nordhaus actually said that a 4-degree increase in temperature was optimal, given the costs of mitigation. 4 degrees Celsius. We're already seeing those effects at 1, and the transition will burn down towns. It's doing that right now in parts of New South Wales, not far from where my sisters lives. So they've delayed the transition to sustainable industry as much as any oil company has done. So it's either a new paradigm or the demise of capitalism, thanks to neoclassical economics. That's what following the wrong paradigm does. It's up to your generation to create the new one. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Keane, for this really interesting and insightful talk. We are now going to move over to the Q&A session. So are there any questions?
Yeah.
In front?
I think you've passed the microphone on, so actually you've got a microphone on your desk, haven't you? Press the button, yeah. Otherwise I won't hear you properly, my bad hearing.
Questions at a time? Should I conduct 3 questions at a time?
Oh, one at a time, so a bit of a dialogue, yeah. It's red, so it must be transmitting. Yes, yeah.
Yeah, so...
And speak closer to my hearing is really bad, so... That's good, yeah.
So, how would you measure, using this system, the value of a capital good? Because in neoclassical economics, I'm just a layperson, so correct me if I'm wrong, it's measured by its rate of profit, but then the rate of profit is dependent on the quantity of capital, which is circular reasoning. And can you solve the capital controversy of this?
Yeah, well, that's what Sraffa did. Okay, that's why you should read Sraffa, because Sraffa's point was, and Joan Robinson made this in arguments with Solo and so on over time as well. We can measure labour and the amount of work done by labour and the income generated independently. You have hours per worker, okay, as your measure of the amount of time going in, and you have the output or the wage as a separate model in dollars per hour. But with machinery, you have, how do you add up the amount of machinery? How do you add, this pointer to that phone? You've got to use the price system to add them together. But when you use the price system depends upon the rate of profit. So you have a circularity. So Sraffa's solution was to say, let's reduce machinery to dated labour. So he said this machine is equivalent to the machinery used to make it 1 year ago, plus the labour involved at that time. And so you've eliminated, what you've done is you've converted 100% capital to, say, 90% capital plus 10% labour. And then you repeat the same process for the year before, and the year before that, and the year before that. And what you get is an expression involving the rate of profit raised to a power, being the number of years ago that this machine was made, times the amount of labour put in, plus the residual, which you can never get rid of. You can't get down to the stage where there's no commodity input, because that would be Harry Potter world, where you can make something out of magic. Okay? But you can reduce it to the stage where predominantly what you've got is terms in terms of dated labour. And then when you work out the mathematics of that, you find that rather than the rate of profit depending upon the amount of capital, the sort of marginal productivity theorem, you get the inverse. The amount of capital you measure you have depends upon the rate of profit, and it's non-linear, highly non-linear relationship. So what that ends up telling you is distribution of income cannot be a marginal productivity theory, because you can't measure the amount of capital in an accurate sense at all. Okay? It depends upon the rate of return. So the return to capital must be a surplus. So that's the brilliant insight that Sraffa had. That's what production of commodities by means of commodities explains. But what I'm saying now is you need to add an energy inside there. You reduce labour and capital to dated energy, because neither labour nor capital would exist or be functional without the energy input. Repeat the same process, reduce it to dated energy, and then you can reduce it almost to zero. In one sense, if you imagined a technologically stable society, which is what Sraffa was working with, so there's no technological change going on, you could do that, and then you would have an energy-dated system, and then using that you could come back and measure how many machines you had. Complicated, that's probably several PhDs, okay? But that's a task worth undertaking.
Thank you.
Another question? Yeah, over there.
And good, loud volume, thanks. Yeah.
Okay.
That's good, yeah.
So, I'm not going to claim that I understood half of the presentation. My knowledge is definitely not enough for that, but it was confusing enough to really get me interested, and I like the really strong attack on neoclassical economics and what seems to me a very sound and founded system to put against it. If somebody would want to join you in your crusade against neoclassical economics, how do you get to the level to understand this? What should one study if they would want to join your Cambridge circus, if you will?
Good question. The absolutely vital thing is stop reading textbooks. Okay? Read them for satirical purposes only. Go to the library, go to the journals. Take a look and see what's going on in the journals. That's why I wrote Debunking Economics, because I'd done that. I was in your situation in first year university when I realised that the textbooks were bullshit. So after I had that talk by Frank Stilwell explaining the theory of the second best and showing that rather than abolishing trade unions, making the world better to make the world worse, according to neoclassical supply and demand analysis, I went down to the library and thought, there's got to be something in the journals about this. If it's not in the textbook, where is it? So I started reading the Journal of Economics at that time, and this was right in the middle of the Cambridge controversy debates. They were all through at that stage. you could get non-orthodox material published in the Journal of Economics. Now they send your paper back unrefereed and refund your submission fee. Okay, literally. I've had that happen. I'm sure Jan and Thomas have as well. But you go and read the original journals. And Debunking Economics is a guide to that. All the 40 years or so of time I've spent reading the original journals, I've pulled out the references, gone backwards in time. I've even benefited from some neoclassicals on that front, because at one stage I joked about whether it be even possible to test the theory of a revealed preference. And actually, one of my friends is sort of half neoclassical, Raja Jananka, a good mate of mine from Western Sydney University. Raja pointed out there was an article that had done that. That's where I found Sipple. So if you go back through the research itself, you can find both the nonsense in its original form, and you can often find good critiques as well. But Debunking Economics, I hate to beat my own barrow, but that'll be the guide for you to get in there in the first instance, and then go from there. I'd also recommend taking a course in differential equations. Okay? That's essential, because otherwise you can't handle complex systems. And that includes adjunct courses in linear algebra, which will be part of the solution systems for differential equations, stability analysis, and things like that. There's a couple of great books I'll recommend. One is by an author called Martin Braun, B-R-A-U-N. It's got a boring title, Ordinary Differential Equations and Their Applications. It's a Springer book. I bought that after I'd learned differential equations to a high level in what is called the honours degree at Sydney University, of New South Wales University. Actually, it's a fourth year. So I did 4 years of mathematics as part of that. And I then looked around for a decent textbook, and I was stunned by how good Braun is. You have to do the exercises. You have to practice the exercises at the end of each chapter, okay? But it's a beautiful piece of writing. For example, you know the idea of carbon dating? Okay. Well, normally you just get the idea you've got this, the rate of decay of a particular isotope of carbon, and that's all you get told. He has a 14-page explanation of how radioactive carbon dating was used to prove that somebody who was alleged to have sold original masterpieces to the Nazis and was therefore in jail after the Second World War, facing execution for being a collaborator, he proved he's actually a forger. And then halfway through in proving he was a forger, the poor bastard had the charge changed from collaborating with the Nazis to forgery. But it's a beautiful explanation. You really fully understand the process when you read that book. And it's got the linear algebra you need as well. So Braun, Ordinary Differential Equations, the best, easiest to read mathematics book I've ever read. Beautifully written. Also a book by a guy called Bossel, B-O-S-S-E-L. It's rather dated these days, and the language he uses is no longer available. But an explanation for simulation, it's a beautiful explanation. That's called Modelling and Simulation. So add those into the mix. Finally, history. And you should learn economic history, social history as well. There's now a historian called Peter Turchin, which is spelled T-U-R-C-H-I-N, and he's applying the same techniques I use for mathematical modelling of the economy in history. And he has a book called Ages of Discord, which is a very well-written book that gives you a mathematical cyclical pulse to history as well. So those would be 3. Go out and buy them references, and you'll be on your way. 4, including my book. Yep, sure.
Okay, so there's no way around economics theory, or?
I actually tell students these days go and do system dynamics instead, learn engineering, and then apply those ideas to economics. I really think an economics degree is a waste of time, fundamentally. You'd be better off, you've got some good lecturers, which you're lucky with, but I would do a couple of economics courses and otherwise learn engineering, maybe physics, and then apply it to economics. You'd be much better off. Your brain gets restructured by reading this stuff. Like, we know neural networks as a model of how the brain functions. And over time, your brain acquires the structure that reproduces the paradigm you've been trained into. That's really the psychological or physiological explanation for the phenomenon that Planck experienced, that highly intelligent people, absolutely mathematically gifted, could not understand what he was talking about. And the reason was their brains would take this in and the neural network would throw it right back out again. So to some extent, not getting infected with it in the first place is a damn good idea.
Do we have another question?
Yeah. Loudly, please, and close to the mic. Yeah.
Okay, actually, I'm in favor of you speaking, speaking, and against.
How are you? Thank you. If you are a Patreon of mine, but I love meeting the patrons when I travel. I've got about 1,200 or so, and it's great. Thank you very much. Nice to know you.
Actually, my PhD research is for your cameras.
Okay.
Actually, I just want to ask a question. Based on your knowledge and the research so far, what kind of issues the financial crisis or something will happen in the future by the increasing private debt?
Yeah, I'm in favour of what I call a modern debt jubilee. And this is the idea that we can use the state's capacity to create money to cancel private debt. And I think this would be more, given the fact that you have a political economy education, you're more likely to accept this to begin with. Since the state can create money, as modern monetary theory argues, and so can the private banks, the central banks have created money for quantitative easing. And of course, in America's case, that was $1 trillion per year for about 8 years. They were creating just by double entry bookkeeping. They'd say, we're going to make an entry in your bank balance at the central bank to the financial institutions of $1 trillion per year. You give us pieces of paper you value at $1 trillion per year with an income yield, buying the bonds off them, and that created all the money. There was no taxation involved at all. So it's the best example to use to people who think the government must tax to be able to pay. Quantitative easing was paid with zero taxation. So the same thing could be done to inject money into private bank accounts. I would do that on the condition that if you had debt, either that paid the debt down or was used as a debt offset. If you didn't have debt, you get a cash injection. And that gets around the moral hazard argument people have against a debt jubilee where debtors have their debt forgiven, but people without debt don't get involved. This way everybody gets per capita the same amount of money. Use that to reduce debt levels by 2/3. I think the level of debt we're carrying as a functional level for most economies is 2 to 3 times as high as it should be. And then what you could do as well, rather than the enormous stimulus that might give too big, you could require part of the money that non-debtors get to be used to buy newly issued shares, which had to be used by corporations to cancel corporate debt. Then you'd have to also change the banking sector to effectively make it impossible for banks to fund asset bubbles. So I bring in a range of rules. One I call it the pill, which used to have more meaning in my generation than yours, but that I call that property income limited leverage. So meaning saying that loans to buy an asset cannot be more than a certain multiple of the income earning potential of the asset, regardless of who's buying it. Because at the moment we compete to buy houses off each other, and the person who gets the higher leverage wins. So we have an individual interest in high leverage, which leads to the sort of crisis we're in now. So I'd change that and say banks can only lend, for example, 10 times the annual rental income of a property to anybody who wants to buy the property, which means prices would fall dramatically. You'd need to compensate those effects as well. But then give banks also the possibility of lending with an equity basis rather than a debt basis so they can fund entrepreneurs. And I call that entrepreneurial equity loans or EELs. So there's a range of things we'd need to do, not just the abolition of debt, but also certainly reduce the level of debt dramatically through a jubilee, bring in controls that stop the banking sector financing asset bubbles, require them effectively to finance entrepreneurs and working capital for corporations, which they've almost stopped doing, and then set the level of debt and the level of credit as targets for macroeconomics, rather than just obsessing about the rate of interest and the rate of inflation and the rate of unemployment. Include the level of credit and the level of debt there as well, and continue using the state's capacity to cancel debt when necessary. So a large range of changes, but they're feasible.
Okay, thank you.
Let's take one of the older guys in the room for a change.
Yeah, thanks for that. Just a quick question, kind of following from the previous one about the state.
Just a bit closer to the mic, thanks. Yeah.
How's that?
Yeah, that's better.
The state's capacity to create money. Do you think you'd agree with people like Stephanie Felton and other economists, and in the way that they would finance the occasionally Cortez Green New Deal?
Yeah, I'm very much in favour of the Green New Deal. What it's really saying is it's not the amount of money or the capacity to create money that's our limitation in fighting climate change. It's mobilising resources fast enough and creating them in the very first instance. So accepting that modern monetary theory is correct about the capacity of the state to create money and finance its own activities, we need that on a monumental scale. We need that on a World War II scale. So definitely in favour of doing it. My problem is, just from watching humanity over time, reading enough history, it's obvious we'd never react to trends that are going to break until after they're broken. We share it with, I see humanity as a belief-sharing animal. We can share beliefs and motivate each other in a way that other species can't do, which means when a trend starts to work, everybody who's riding the trend wants to keep it going forever. Now you can have iconoclasts like myself who say that trend can't be sustained. You won't be listened to until after it breaks. Now with the financial crisis, when I saw that was going to happen, and it wasn't a precise prediction of timing, by the way, it was simply saying there was an unsustainable trend in private debt that had to break. When that trend broke, there'd be negative credit. That will cause, given the level of debt and the level of credit that I saw, that'll cause the biggest crisis since the Great Depression. That's as much as I could do. But I knew in the aftermath there'd be government spending and there'd be central bank activity. You could rescue the economy from that. This time round, when we realise we've gone far too far in overloading the planet, there is no central bank of the ecology. So, and we don't have the engineers and the factories we need to design and to make the machinery that can produce energy without creating carbon dioxide. And even if we did have that, we've gone two or five times past the scale of human activity on this planet that we actually should have to make the ecology sustainable. So the Green New Deal is the least of our difficulties. Now, I don't think there'll be anything to be done about it on any significant scale until after we get obviously incontrovertible proof that even climate change deniers are going to have to admit they got it wrong. Maybe the sun's closer than they thought, you know. Then we'll start seeing action. But the advantage of doing the Green New Deal is to get the infrastructure in place before it's necessary. It's like designing war bonds before the war starts. So definitely in favour of that proposal.
One final question. Yeah, on that.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, but just you're actually too close. Leave the mic on, please. That's good, yeah.
Okay, two very good questions. One, you criticized neoclassical for not having a definition of money.
Yeah.
What would be your definition of money?
Mm-hmm.
And following onwards on that, Elia Recreative Economics, I can't remember who wrote it, unfortunately, who said that the dangers of MMT, the real danger was that it decoupled money supply and money from actual production.
Mm.
So, following on your definition of money, does that make sense?
Yeah. My definition of money, by the way, comes from Graziani. That's why I said I read Graziani, The Monetary Theory of Production, which you can find online in what's called the Thames Papers in Political Economy. Download that and have a read. His definition of money is a promise to pay that third parties accept the transfer of as complete closure of a commodity transaction. So he starts by three principles. He said that to be a monetary economy, what you use as money cannot be a commodity. Because if you're using a commodity as money, you're still in a barter system. You've just chosen one particular commodity to do the barter through. It's still a barter system. So it has to be a non-commodity. Secondly, it has to be accepted as means of final payment. Because if I buy something off you with an IOU, say, I'm going to buy your scarf off you, so here's an IOU for 100, Thomas, and I'll pay you later. There's still a relationship between us. Okay, if I don't honour that, he's got rights to come and get me strangled by his scarf in London one day. So it has to be final payment. And then thirdly, it can't create rights of seniorage for the issuer. Now that's a bit dicky because some banks get completely around that, and obviously the government benefits from seniorage as well. But he said, for those conditions to be met, money must be a promise to pay of a third party. Okay? So if you think about your bank accounts, if you buy something off someone, you're making a transfer from your bank account to their bank account, and they give you the commodity back, and you can walk out the shop. And if anything goes wrong with their bank, it's their problem, nothing to do with you. Okay? So it's a promise to pay. That's the important thing. Then the question of money versus production. I think MMT has done an excellent job in building a foundation for a monetary analysis of capitalism. You also need a physical analysis of capitalism. And that's people like Koleski's work, like Schraffer's, like the work I'm doing on thermodynamics as well. That's necessary. You have to have that as well. And it's all very well, for example, to talk about increasing the money supply and providing what you need. You have to be able to produce that as well, which requires the engineers, the machine tools people, the factories, and so on. So you need a combination of the two and see the interrelations between them. So it can't just be a monetary theory. As Graziani put it beautifully in the title of his paper, we need a monetary theory of production. What I'm saying here as well, we need a monetary theory, we need a monetary theory of production and waste.
Okay, before we close off, I was just going to ask one summary question about the talk, because you said in many sciences it takes a death to change the paradigm, but in economics we've seen a lot of deaths and we haven't seen paradigm shift. But don't you think we are at sort of a tipping point where governments are listening to economists that are from the Neoclassical school of thought, but they are sort of running out of answers with their modeling when it comes to issues like climate change, like issues of private debt and credit, because they just can't factor them into their models. And people realize that governments that listen to economic experts, which are neoclassical economists, don't have any answers to their problems, and people become really unhappy with the situation, so that at some point governments will maybe have to change and have to listen to other people that actually can deliver answers to the questions that the populations have for them, because otherwise, as you said, we're going to end up in a really critical civil state. So don't you think that we can maybe through bottom-up dynamics get like a top-down change through governments?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And one thing I'm very, very pleased about as an old man now, sorry, memories, is you're doing what I was doing in my youth. Okay? I occupied the Vice Chancellor's office. I fought for a department, political economy. We won. We didn't do the right... Sorry, I'm writing my autobiography right now. You're there. We didn't have any funding. It was one group at one university on the planet, Sydney University, in 1973. The political economy department continued after that. It's done some good stuff, but it's actually eschewed mathematical analysis for the false reason that they think neoclassicals use mathematics. Neoclassicals do not. They abuse mathematics. I call what they do mythematics, not mathematics. They haven't used the one weapon we really had to use against neoclassicals, which is sophisticated mathematical thinking and system dynamics. So that's a flaw. But we're on our own. We're still going. It's still alive. It's still doing good work. But it just was a brief flare at Sydney University in 1973. And it's continued on. With Rethinking Economics, which began, of course, in 2010 in Manchester. I think it was 2010. And the fact that you've got some funding that keeps you going, the Soros Institute and a few others, the INET and so on, People for a New Economy, all those groups funding you to keep going. That's fabulous. So you've spread all over the world. It's particularly, rethinking is very big in the UK. And again, hats off to the UK students for doing that. There's some momentum. You continue harassing these people, and you can also be part of the foundation that builds the new people that are necessary for a new paradigm. So there is chance there. Also, you're quite right about institutions that need policy advice being the ones that are most open to non-orthodox thinking. So I gave a speech at the OECD on climate change just recently, eviscerating the work of Nordhaus. And there's no way I would have got there without the financial crisis beforehand, because that was enough of a warning to the OECD that mainstream economics had led it astray, because it was one of the many organisations saying what a fabulous year 2008 was going to be. Okay? Now, they've still got Neoclassical Economics inside it, still got a large neoclassical research group, but they also have what they call new approaches to economic challenges. The Bank of England. I was actually visiting the Bank of England before they came out with that paper in 2014. So they realised they got it wrong. And they started appointing non-orthodox thinkers. One of my ex-master's students is now one of their experts on shadow banking, using Minsky, as it happens. So there's a willingness to accept non-orthodox thought in advisory agents for the government and supranational bodies like the OECD that there wasn't 10 years ago. So that's also a positive thing. So between you harassing the mainstream and learning alternative approaches at university and institutions like the OECD, the Bank of England, the IMF perhaps at some point, actually looking for non-orthodox thinkers, there's a chance to help overthrow that dominant ideology called a paradigm called Neoclassical Economics.
Thank you very much. Now we unfortunately have to stop here before we get kicked out. So I would like to once again thank Steve Keen for coming all the way up here and sharing his ideas with us. Thank you very much.